Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Glad to be here for another one.
Yeah, so today I want you to picture something. Just, imagine you were walking down Main Street in Winnipeg.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. But it is the early 1930s. We are talking smack in the middle of the dirty 30s.
Oh, man, the absolute worst of the Great Depression.
Exactly. And the scene the source material paints is just, it's bleak. You were walking south from the Canadian Pacific Railway underpass, and you just see hundreds of transient men.
Just sauntering aimlessly.
Yeah, exactly. Leaning against empty storefronts, sleeping on crowded riverbanks, or just huddled in abandoned sheds. It is a completely overwhelmed city.
And that is exactly what our deep dive is focusing on today. We are looking at this incredible historical account, See What God Has Done, by Edward Hughes.
Which is all about the history of the Union Gospel Mission, or UGM, in Winnipeg.
Right. And UGM's core mission from day one was reaching what they called the least, the last, and the lost.
And that brings up the big question we really need to unpack today. When you look at your city and you see this absolute, what the book calls, a vortex of hopelessness.
A vortex, yeah, that constant downward pull.
Right, when it just never relents. How do you actually translate pious good intentions into concrete action?
It's the ultimate question for any grassroots movement.
Because it is easy to have empathy, right?
Yeah.
But it is really hard to build a structured lifeline. And this book isn't just a history lesson. It is a literal blueprint for how that happens.
So true. And to understand the blueprint, you really have to look at the architects. You cannot separate the institution from the specific people who decided to just, stand in the gap.
Yeah, you have to look at Bert and Jesse Dartnell.
Right. The Dartnells, they are the entire foundational spark in the dark here.
And their background is so interesting because they weren't like these wealthy elites tossing coins from a balcony.
Not at all. Bert's family actually emigrated from Ireland, from Cork, I believe, over to Winnipeg.
Yeah, back when it was a booming agricultural hub. And he meets Jesse as a teenager at a local ice skating rink.
It's such a quintessential, wholesome start to their story.
It really is. But then you hit October 1933, and UGM officially comes into being.
Though it's worth noting, Edward Clark was technically the first director.
Technically, yeah. But the source makes it very clear that the Dartnells were the engine.
Oh, absolutely. The logistics of their startup phase are just wild. They rented this main floor hall in the Bonaccord building.
Which was just this humble little spot. And they had zero budget.
Zero. I mean, they were literally pulling chairs from refuse heaps.
Begging for them, borrowing them, rescuing them from the trash, cleaning them up.
And then they somehow get their hands on 1,000 copies of a hymnal. Redemption songs and solos.
From an unknown source, right?
Ugh.
Just this random anonymous channel.
Yeah, it's so scrappy. That's the ultimate 1930s startup.
But instead of venture capital, their seed funding was, it was incredibly sparse. They had one guy, Sidney Smith, a philanthropist, who gave them $1,000.
Which was huge back then.
Right, massive. But other than that, the only other recorded sustaining pledge was from one dedicated woman.
And she pledged what exactly?
$1 a month. Until her death.
Wow, $1.
Right. But that just perfectly illustrates their core philosophy, which the book highlights as sacrificial service.
And we really need to define what sacrificial service meant for the Dartnells, because Bert worked a full-time job.
Yeah, he worked at a foundry all day.
And working in a 1930s foundry is not like sitting at a desk.
No, it is grueling. You are talking 10 to 12 hours of extreme heat, toxic air, just bone-crushing physical labor.
So he is finishing his shift completely exhausted, probably operating at a massive caloric deficit.
And his mission work starts after that.
It's crazy. It completely dominated their family life.
The book talks about these rushed suppers. They would literally leave their kids to clear the table and wash the dishes.
Just so they could catch a streetcar and get down to the mission 6 nights a week.
6 nights a week. It sounds like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup, honestly.
Yeah. It really does. In an era of total economic stagnation, where do you even start?
Well, Bert started with his own pockets. The physical and emotional toll was just staggering.
Yeah, the text mentions he would buy bed tickets at the Salvation Army hostel out of his own pocket.
For guys who had literally nowhere else to go.
Or he'd be shaking hands at the door after a service, and he'd just quietly slip a hungry man some coins for a meal.
Out of his own foundry wages. It is just radical, frictionless intervention.
Right. There's no intake form, there's no bureaucracy, just immediate localized grace.
But, having established who they were, we have to look at how they did it.
The ground war.
Exactly. Because this is the 1930s. No social media, no modern marketing. What does an outreach strategy even look like?
It looked like standing on a freezing sidewalk handing out pieces of paper.
The tract distribution. Guys like Ernest Ellis and Cecil Canning just standing out on Main Street.
Yeah, just trying to hand religious tracts to these hardened, starving, transient men.
I got to be honest, when I read that, it seemed a bit, passive. Doesn't that seem a bit weak for such a tough street?
I mean, through a modern lens, maybe, but the source is very clear that it was actually incredibly dangerous.
Wait, really? Dangerous how?
These tract distributors faced intense verbal abuse and even physical abuse.
Over a piece of paper.
Well, think about it. Approaching a hostile, alienated man on the street and telling him he needs salvation, it's confrontational.
Ah, I see. So it was a frontline battle. They were claiming territory.
Exactly. They were absorbing the hostility to show unshakable commitment.
Okay, so they're handing out tracts outside. But what's happening inside to draw people in?
Friday nights were the massive draw. They ran a Magic Lantern series.
Oh, this was fascinating. They brought in C.L. Johnston from Elam Chapel, right?
Yeah, and he would project these glass slides depicting biblical characters like the Pilgrim's Progress with a script.
In 1933, that's basically going to an IMAX movie for free.
It was hugely popular. The hall was packed. And Thursday nights were also big, run by Dr. Hugh and Dr. Isabel Monroe.
The chiropractors, with the quartet singing.
Yes. But here is the critical part about those Magic Lantern shows. Burt Dartnell was obsessive about their core message.
He wouldn't let them just run the show for entertainment value.
No. He fastidiously reviewed every single script beforehand. If it didn't align perfectly with the scriptures, he changed it.
It's like extreme brand integrity. He refused to dilute the message just to keep the seats full.
Which is a temptation every single nonprofit faces, even today.
Right. Do we soften the message to keep our numbers up? Burt said absolutely not.
And that strict adherence led to some just miraculous transformations.
We have to talk about Joe the bank robber.
Oh, Joe is the ultimate proof of concept for UGM.
Joe was a violent career criminal. The book describes him bearing these indelible scars across his back.
From a cat-o'-nine-tails flogging, judicially ordered.
Which is just horrific to even think about. The trauma of that.
Right. A man brutalized by the justice system is going to be incredibly paranoid and hostile.
But he gets saved at the mission. And the trust dynamic Burt establishes with him is mind-blowing.
Tell them about the money bag.
Okay, so Burt has this canvas bag of the mission's operating funds. Yeah. Real cash.
Right.
And he hands it to Joe, convicted bank robber, and says, hey, go across the street and deposit this in the bank for us.
It's just an insane operational risk.
But Joe does it. He clutches the bag tightly, walks across Main Street, and makes the deposit.
Because Burt completely subverted Joe's expectations of the world. He treated a branded criminal as a trusted steward.
And you can't fake that. That raw trust is what actually changes a person.
Yeah, that localized intervention is amazing, but their reach was also weirdly vast because of those paper tracks we mentioned.
Oh, the miner from Thompson. This story is so good.
It's incredible. So you have this miner working way up north in Thompson.
Hundreds of miles away.
Right. And he takes the train down to Winnipeg, gets completely drunk, and then boards the train to go back.
And while he's on the train, he sees these paper tracks scattered on the seats.
Left there by some idiot, as he thought at the time.
Right. So he grabs them thinking, hey, free kindling for my stove up north.
So he takes them back to his cabin in Thompson. He's literally about to burn them.
He strikes a match, and just as they're catching fire, the title catches his eye.
Because it specifically mentions a miner.
Yeah. So he pulls it out of the fire, reads it, and his whole life changes.
But the punchline is the best part.
So months later, he's down in Winnipeg, completely sober. He's at UGM telling this exact story to Frank Coop and Henry Unruh.
He's complaining about the idiot who left the tracks on the train.
Completely unaware that Henry Unruh, sitting right in front of him, was the guy who left them there.
Henry was the idiot. It's just such a perfect closing of the loop.
It really reframes the whole handing out tracks thing. It wasn't passive, it was planting dormant seeds.
But, relying on that kind of sheer relational willpower from a founder like Burt Dartnell has a shelf life.
Yeah, it takes a massive biological toll. And eventually, a grassroots movement has to survive its founders.
Which brings us to the evolution of leadership. Bert's health starts to severely decline.
The foundry work plus the mission work just broke him down physically.
So the UGM board realizes they need a full-time, financially supported superintendent, and they spend 3 years praying and planning for this.
3 years. That shows how heavily they felt the weight of replacing Bert.
They eventually bring in Frank Coop. He was a student from the Winnipeg Bible Institute.
And the book describes Frank as the Joshua to follow the Moses of the Main Street ministry.
Which, I mean, talk about pressure. It's like a rookie quarterback stepping in for a Hall of Fame legend.
Exactly. The expectations are just enormous. But Frank brought his own quiet, unassuming fire to the role.
He really did. And crucially, he didn't have to do the administrative stuff alone because in 1958, Jim Hadlin arrives.
Right. Jim was a Canadian Pacific Railway office manager.
He brought that intense military-grade administrative skill to the acting superintendent role.
So you have this shift from sheer willpower to sustainable structure. But Frank kept the frontline empathy alive.
Oh, without a doubt. Just look at Art's story.
Yeah, Art. Frank literally finds Art collapsed on the doorstep of the mission.
Emaciated, filthy, runny nose.
Yeah.
Just in terrible physical shape.
And Art tells Frank that he had blacked out in Thunder Bay, Ontario.
Which is hours and hours away.
And he woke up in Winnipeg, right in front of the Countess of Dufferin train. He completely lost days of his life.
It's terrifying. But Frank doesn't hand him an intake form. He just puts his arm around him.
He brings him in. And Art gets sober. But what is so cool about UGM's evolving structure is that they hired Art.
Right, for $10 a month.
$10 a month to be Frank's right-hand man, giving him immediate responsibility.
It gives him a stake in his own community. And Art eventually moves to BC.
But he stays tethered to Frank. The book talks about these annual phone calls.
The emotional hook of those calls is so strong, Art would just call and say, "Frank, it's been 2 years."
Marking his sobriety. Frank, it's been 3 years.
Just using Frank as the anchor for his new life. It's beautiful.
It really is. But, with new leadership comes new ambition. They had stabilized the city operation, so they tried to scale.
Yeah, the mission transitions from just feeding and housing men to attempting some pretty radical interventions.
Which brings us to Marshall Calverley from 1965 to 1973.
Calverley was well connected with the International Union of Gospel Missions, and he wanted to try a farm program.
Okay, so a farm program. They used his father's farm, which was, wait for it, 132 miles away.
Supervised by his son, Ron.
So why a farm? Like, what is the psychology there?
The idea is to physically remove the men from their triggers.
The Main Street environment.
Exactly. You walk out the doors of UGM and your drinking buddies are right there. The cheap alcohol is right there.
So they thought, let's extract them. Replace the chaos of the city with fresh air and energetic farm chores.
A geographic cure.
Yeah.
But operationally, it failed.
Yeah. 132 miles is a massive logistical strain.
Especially back then. It just overtaxed the staff completely. They couldn't sustain the supply lines.
But the book points out that it wasn't a total failure. Because of one guy.
Right, the guy identified as Jay.
Jay was a former bank manager. He'd fallen all the way down to being a Skid Row bum, literally begging for a winter overcoat.
And the farm program saved him. The isolation actually worked for his specific recovery.
So it was a logistical failure, but a human victory. Still, they realized they had to fight the battle inside the city.
Which tees up Peter and Susan Dyke from 1973 to 1988.
And talk about scaling. Peter Dyke expanded their mailing list from 2,800 names to 17,000 names.
An astounding jump. And he did it through just relentless visitation in southern Manitoba, driving to all these rural towns.
And because of that list, he builds this massive new facility in 1981. But here's the crazy part. How did he fund it?
Well, usually you need mega donors for a huge building.
But they funded it entirely on nickels and dimes. The largest single gift was just $5,000.
It's incredible. How do you get 17,000 ordinary people to buy into your vision like that?
Radical authenticity. Peter was just incredibly personally invested.
Oh, the story about his coat and socks.
Yes. If a freezing man came in, Peter would literally give him the socks right off his own feet.
He'd tell his wife, Susan, "I can go home in the van. Their need was greater than mine."
And Susan was right there with him. She would bring these down and outers into their actual home for Sunday dinner.
That level of authenticity is what inspires a farmer in rural Manitoba to send in his nickels and dimes. You can't fake that commitment.
No, you really can't. So now the physical building is huge. The funding is secure. But the nature of addiction on the street was getting much worse.
Much more complex. So how do you modernize the process of salvation from the 1930s soup and sermons to late 20th century holistic treatment?
Enter Bill McNairn in 1988.
With his mantra from his old mentor, organize, deputize, soup arrives.
I love that. He recognized the sheer volume they were handling. I mean, they served 90,000 meals to transients in 1989 alone.
It's a massive food distribution network at that point. But food alone doesn't fix chemical dependency.
Right. So they roll out the 4-phase holistic program. And phase 1 is intense.
A 2-week lockdown.
Yeah. New residents literally cannot leave the mission without a staff member for the first 2 weeks.
Which sounds harsh, right? But you really have to dive into the psychology and physiology of what they were dealing with.
They weren't just dealing with guys who drank too much beer.
No, we are talking about severe chemical dependencies. Cheap wine, yes, but also rubbing alcohol, glue, street drugs.
And when a guy is physically addicted to rubbing alcohol, the withdrawal is violent.
Exactly. You cannot just preach to a man who is experiencing violent physical convulsions from withdrawal.
The 2-week lockdown was basically a medical necessity disguised as a mission rule. They had to clear the chemicals out of their systems.
And once they cleared that hurdle, they moved to phase 2, 4 weeks of using the 12 steps.
But with a twist. The director of counseling, Rod Buxton, comprehensively cross-referenced the 12 steps with Scripture.
And his philosophy on this is fascinating. He didn't view the 12 steps as the actual salvation.
Right. He viewed the addiction as a deadening effect, like a fog.
You have to use the 12 steps to clear that deadening fog so the person's cognitive ability returns.
It's like a multi-stage rocket. The soup kitchen is the launch pad, right?
Our analogy, yeah.
The 2-week detox is breaking through the intense atmosphere of physical dependency.
Yeah.
And then the counseling and the 12 steps are the orbital maneuvering.
Keeping them in a stable new life so they can actually make a conscious choice about their faith.
Exactly. And to really grasp this, we have to look at the story of Dick Neufeld. It is both incredibly triumphant and deeply tragic.
It really highlights the literal life and death stakes the staff face every single day.
So Dick was a miner, a highly successful guy who literally lost $1 million career to the bottle.
The descent was brutal.
There was this one heartbreaking image in the source. It was Dick's birthday, and he promised his family he'd be home.
But he went drinking instead.
Right. And he finally stumbles into his house at 3 a.m., and he finds his 13-year-old son, Henry.
Oh, this part is so sad.
Henry had fallen asleep on the Chesterfield, and he is still clutching a wrapped birthday present against his chest.
Just waiting for a dad who never showed up. The generational damage there is so heavy.
Dick eventually hits absolute rock bottom. He goes on a 7-day, 7-night continuous bender in a hotel room.
Just pushing his body to the absolute brink.
His body is violently trembling, and he somehow forces himself out of that room and gets to the mission.
And the 4-phase program works for him.
It does. He gets completely clean. He restores his life. He even becomes a pastor for UGM.
Which is amazing. He starts ministering to the exact same demographic he used to be a part of.
But this is where the reality of the work is just agonizing. As a pastor, Dick tries to help this young, highly intelligent drug addict.
The kid who made the Columbus joke, right?
Yeah. He joked that if Columbus hadn't come from Turkey, native people would be called turkeys.
Sharp kid.
But deeply addicted. Dick begs him to get clean. He pleads with him to enter the program.
And the kid just says it's impossible. The chemical hold is too strong.
So he walks out. And just a week later, Dick is watching the TV news.
And the kid is on there.
Yeah. The young man had been murdered, stabbed over 50 times.
So it is just a devastating reality check.
You can have the best programs, the best intentions, the best staff who used to be in their shoes, and you still lose people to the vortex.
It really puts the rescue and rescue mission into perspective. It is a literal battlefield.
So just to recap this incredible journey, we started with Bert Dartnell handing out borrowed hymnals and paying for beds out of his pocket in 1933.
And we watched it scale into this massive multi-phase treatment center serving 90,000 meals a year.
Built almost entirely on the nickels and dimes of regular working-class people who saw the authentic sacrifice of the leaders.
But the source notes, they aren't stopping there. They have these future dreams.
Right. Looking forward, they want to establish a truly indigenous church for street people,
where the people themselves are leading the congregation. And they also talked about building a Christian school.
specifically for children from damaged, addicted families.
To break that generational cycle of dysfunction before it starts. Think about little Henry on the Chesterfield.
Exactly. Intercepting the trauma early.
Which brings up a really provocative thought from the source text that we should leave everyone with.
The author notes that if Bert and Jessie Dartnell could somehow walk down Main Street in Winnipeg today,
They would marvel at the modern buildings, the technology, the scale of UGM today.
but they would also shake their heads sadly. Because the core human needs, the brokenness, it remained exactly the same as it was in 1933.
The chemicals might be different, the streets might be paved better, but the vortex of hopelessness is identical.
So as we build these smarter cities and roll out better technology, we have to ask ourselves, are we actually solving the problem or just putting a shiny new coat of paint over the same old human despair?
It requires actual people.
Right. So who are the Bert and Jessie Dartnells of your community today? Who is willing to step out of their comfort zone and actually do the grueling, sacrificial work?
Yeah.
Something to really ponder.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the tough questions, and we will catch you on the next one.